that's got to be hard on your ego also, that you were, at such heights, and then you were playing such large arenas, and now you're playing clubs. And plus, it's probably not natural to work with your brother for all those years, attached at the hip for all those years. It, you know, it,
Hmm.
well, it was a perfect storm by 1973 when they broke up.
Welcome to Life's Third Act, an enlightening look at estate planning, retirement, and beyond.
Welcome to another episode of Life's Third Act. As is our custom, we look for opportunities to learn. And who better to learn from than celebrities? And we learn some positive things, but as you might expect, we see lots of mistakes too. And it seems that we learn more from mistakes often than we do when people do things correctly. So we want to continue that tradition, and we've come across a tremendous opportunity. So the Everly brothers need no introduction, but we'll talk more about them in detail. Some of you may not realize exactly how big they were if you're, say, under 50, maybe under 40. But anyway, so we'll talk about that. But there's actually a family member that we've been able to touch base through and through a series of referrals who has been willing to talk to us about her dad, a little bit about the Everly brothers in general, and more specifically about some of the challenges that were associated with the estate. I mean, with the passing of Don Everly, who was the older brother. So we'll talk about both Don as well as his brother Phil, but we see lots of opportunities here to learn, and also about the challenges that planning an estate can be, especially when you have several marriages, as we've seen several times on the show, and you have stepchildren, and you have the stepmom, and often the relationships that stereotypically and all too often actually come along with that. That it kind of sets the stage for things to go sideways. And we want to talk about that so we can learn more. And thankfully, we have Venetia who's willing to talk and share. And she has some of her family, well, at least her daughter with her, and a very good friend that I'll let you introduce each of these people, Venetia.
Well, this is my daughter, Arabella,
Hello.
and this is my friend RJ and Robert Johnson.
So RJ had an opportunity to know your dad, and he particularly knows the business, the industry, and he's a bit of an authority on how the music business works behind the scenes. He's been involved in a variety of different ways, and we'll talk about that when we better introduce him in a few minutes. So he brings something to the show that allows us to round out this discussion much better than we could otherwise. So let's start. Sherry, do you want to lead off, and let's do a little bit of discussion around Don's earlier life?
Well, I think anyone who knows music needs to know, if they don't already know, about the Everly Brothers. They had some big hits. Oh my gosh, Wake Up Little Susie, All I Have to Do Is Dream, Bye Bye Love. I mean, they're just classic hits. And with those hits, I mean, they have so many accolades. I mean, they are members of the Country Music Hall of Fame, Nashville Songwriters Hall of Fame, a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. So they're out there. So even our younger viewers, I mean, if you've ever been to the Hollywood Walk of Fame and you're looking down, you're going to say, "Hey, who are the Everly Brothers?" Right? And so it's so easy to find out more and more about what they have done, but they have left behind so much great music, as well as, well, a little bit of a mess, but a wonderful daughter and three other children, right? Venetia. So you have three step siblings, correct?
Siblings, yes.
Okay. And you are from his first marriage
Yes.
and
I
his
want to add
oldest.
something else. They
Yes.
also were in the inaugural class of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, which is a very important honor to be there. And they also have a Lifetime Achievement Grammy.
Yes, the list of accolades are just, I mean, huge.
Yes.
And one thing that came to my attention that as I started preparing for this show, and I, of course, knew about the Everly Brothers, but I didn't know the extent to which they are actually among that class of greats who are most admired by people in the industry, which is the greatest compliment. It's like they're musicians, and
Mhm.
they're the people that the people we would otherwise look up to also look up to. And
Mhm.
I started reading some of the comments of people in the business, but Paul McCartney and others who simply say that for example, Don's guitarmanship. That sometimes goes unnoticed because we don't associate the type of genre he was playing with, with the opportunity to do great things on guitar. But he was a great guitarist, and also the voice. I mean, Don had. I mean, they both had good voices, but Don clearly had this very special voice.
Well, yes, Uncle Phil had an amazing harmony also. So I mean, it just the two of them, it was just magic when they sang together. They said, I remember reading a quote that my father had said was that they're two separate men, but when they got together and they sang, that some magic happened and something out of this world happened. And I don't even think they had to practice it or anything. It just came out when they sang. They just knew
Yep.
what the other one was thinking at the time.
And it sounds like, I mean, it was total natural thing
Yes.
for them because their family was involved too. So their mom, their dad, and I'm just wondering, Venetia and perhaps Arabella, do you both sing too?
I do not. I don't.
Arabella?
Well, I've been trying. I've been thinking about getting into the music industry, but I've been so busy working a full-time job and then also doing real estate. I think that throwing music on there would just be a lot, but I do love it. So, I mean, definitely not, wouldn't be crazy if it happened.
Yeah, well, you hear now more commonly families that have a couple of generations that are independently become great music. Especially, why do I think this happens more in country music? But all the examples that are coming to my mind are country music. I mean, Willie Nelson, Waylon Jennings, who
Mhm.
else? We have their kid, oh, Hank Williams. So we have, yeah,
Yeah.
these generations.
I think a lot of times that I've seen is maybe the boys are more likely to go into it. Like in our family, we have definitely musicians of our generation. The men have been involved.
So one other comment, and we'll move it forward, is tying in with what you had said, Sherry, is these voices, some voice experts have suggested that I've read that because they were raised together and they started singing together very small, their family, of course, as you said, Sherry was all in, that they developed this sort of understanding of each other's voices, coupled with any biological help that might have been, from being in the same family. And but it just did. It produced this miraculous synchronicity of sorts. So let's move on. So they originally started the family, and then soon it became just the two boys. That happened fairly early.
I guess it probably didn't feel that way to them, but my grandfather was a musician before, a guitarist, a very good guitarist. He's been honored in the four thumb pickers up in Kentucky. The original, he's also original member of the Thumb Pickers Association. The first year that they Mose Rager, um, Kennedy Jones, Merle Travis, my grandfather helped teach Merle Travis how to thumb pick. But they were a family act to start with. So my grandfather they moved to Chicago, and my Uncle Phil was actually born in Chicago. And then they decided they didn't want the big city for their kids, and they moved to Iowa. There, my grandfather got on the radio, the early morning radio shows. My grandmother joined him. They had two small kids. My dad started when I would say he's 5 years old, singing on the radio. And then my Uncle Phil followed. He's a couple of years younger. And then they were a family act until they moved to Knoxville from Iowa when radio was starting to slow down. And they got on the Kaz Walker show.
I remember the Kaz Walker show. I grew up in Williamsburg, Kentucky, so I was an hour from
Oh,
Knoxville.
awesome.
Kaz Walker was big. I suspect that 98% of the people watching this, just so you know, Venetia, you might not be surprised. No one's heard of Kaz Walker, I don't think. But he was a character. He
Yes.
was a RJ, did you know it, Kaz Walker or of him?
Yep.
Yeah, he was a character. He owned grocery stores, but so I didn't know there was this connection. They were on his show.
Yes, they were. They came, I believe they auditioned the minute they got to Knoxville and immediately got on the show as the act of the four. And then at one point, my grandmother and granddaddy, I think they realized that the boys would maybe do better by themselves. And they were teenagers at this point, maybe 15 and 16, 17. and they stepped back. And then my dad and uncle got fired from the Kaz Walker show because I believe because their hair was too long, and
I believe that would do it.
they were kind of wanting to go the rock and roll way after they'd heard Bo Diddley, and were just something different was coming through with them. And Chet Atkins had been responsible for, was a friend of my grandfather's who he respected my grandfather's guitar playing, Ike. And Chet Atkins just told him come to Nashville because after my grandfather told Chet about them. And they came, and my dad had a couple of little recordings. One was pretty a hit with Kitty Wells, and they used that money to move back to Nashville. And they're a few years into it. I think they got here in 1956 or 55, and they were here. And then then they got, everyone knows the Everlys know of them being with Acuff Rose and Cadence Records, and that happened in 1957, and that's when their real success started.
Yeah, I didn't know that your dad had not your grandfather rather, had a relationship with Chet Atkins. But that kind of makes sense. I was wondering how they came to the attention of Chet Atkins. I know he played a pivotal role, but and now it makes sense that he knew your grandfather's guitarmanship or knew of him in the business.
And I believe Chet was from East Tennessee. And I mean,
Yeah.
East Tennessee, Kentucky, it's pretty small group of the guitar players that are around there, and they all know each
Yeah.
other. So, I mean, there was a lot of magic that made it happen, but it's also, they'd been working their whole life. I mean, my dad and uncle, they were never paper boys. They were never worked at a gas station or anything. They didn't have young teenage jobs. They were musicians from the get-go. And that, that was their life.
And Venetia, did you get to watch them perform? Did you get to know them? Did you hang out with your grandma and grandpa when you were
With my
little growing up?
grandparents, I did. I spent my younger childhood with my grandparents until my mom remarried, and then I was back and forth between my grandparents and my mom. And I listened to, my grandparents play music a lot. My grandfather, I really get mad at myself for this, tried to teach me to thumb pick when I was a little girl, and I never had the time for it. I didn't want to do it. And I suppose I didn't have whatever it took, but still should have, took him up on it. But he just was on me all the time to learn to play the guitar.
Hmm. Well, so they and we'll move along. We'll pick up our pace a little bit so we can get through this. But they signed a contract. The Everly brothers, just the two brothers, they signed a contract. What, in around 58?
No,
When
57, I would say.
57, and so they very soon started generating hits.
Yeah,
And as a matter of fact,
right out the door. When they got Bye Bye Love, that was like, that had been turned down by everyone. And then they got it, and Cadence, was a record company out of New York. And Archie Blair came to Nashville, and they were recorded with Chet and all them, the studio players at Studio B. And yeah, right out the door. But they had been on Columbia Records in 1955 or 56 for a little short time. And it was the music they put out there was just like, I think it was just two records and two songs, and it was very country what they put out there. It wasn't really
yeah,
what the parts were.
yeah, they weren't sure
They were dropped.
what to make of him. Yeah. So then, so they very quickly cranked out a number of hits with this second label that they were with, and it's as if probably 80 to 90% of their hits probably occurred between 58 and what, or 63, 4, early 60s.
Yeah, 61, 62. I mean, I think they had continued success in England. Like, there's some songs that, if you're an Everly Brother fan, you'd know them, but like they continued to churn out some hits in England past the time when America was they were slowing down here. And then they went to the Marines, and I think it slowed down even more. And then there was some issues with my father's health, and things slowed down, and the Beatles came, and even though the Beatles were so influenced by them, the Beatles
Yeah.
hurt a lot of the American musicians at that time.
Yeah. So I know that they one of the mistakes, I guess they would regard it as a mistake in retrospect. It wasn't apparent at the time when they switched to their third label. They lost that songwriting team that had
Yes.
generated so many hits for them. What was the name of that songwriting team? Do you know?
Hugo
But
and Felice Bryant.
yeah, Boodle, Bryant, and Felicia.
Okay. So, and you may be able to talk a little bit about this period, RJ. And toward that end, tell us a little bit about yourself. Give us a thumbnail overview.
Well, I grew up in Memphis and grew up with around a lot of Sun Records people. And my one of my friends in high school, I'm junior high school, he grew up with Chet Atkins, and he would come to our neighborhood all the time. So I got exposed to this at a very early age. I used to cut Bill Black's yard with lawnmower, and he was Elvis's bass player. And all these guys lived in my neighborhood, Sun Records guys, Sam Phillips's brother, just musicians everywhere. And so by the time I was 17, I was playing guitar with Isaac Hayes. At the time, who was the number one black entertainer in America. And after that, I ended up moving to England myself in the summer of '74 and getting an audition for John Entwistle's band, the bass player of the
Yeah.
Who, the year off because they did the Tommy movie and they wanted to take a break for touring and just being crazy for 10 years. But Entwistle continued on. So I was in his band for a year and did a record with him.
What did you play? You played guitar?
Yeah. And then while I
Oops.
was in Twistle, I auditioned for the Rolling Stones when Mick Taylor left the band. And this past week or so ago, January 31st, was the 50th anniversary that myself and Jeff Beck simultaneously auditioned for the Rolling Stones and played on the Black and Blue sessions in Rotterdam, Holland. So I did one
Oh,
interview and it's gone global and it's gotten over 200 million visible views and reports. It was just completely nuts. So anyway, that's a little bit.
so you have a good feel for the industry, and you were and you had you interacted with the Everly brothers. Is that accurate? Or are you too young?
No, I've met them several times. They would come here to Memphis and play the Mid-South Fair a lot. So I saw them there several times and through Chet Atkins and Tony Cinciola, who was in a band going back to the late 40s, early 50s with Chet. So I was able to get to them through that connection right there, through the Chet Atkins connection. Right now, I'm producing Billy Gibbons from ZZ Top. I'm producing Ann Wilson from Heart. I'm producing Tanya Tucker and Little Anthony, just to name it, four people that, and a million other things. But I'm actually in the recording studio with them over the last 6 months. All four of those are different projects, of course. But
And you've played guitar on a number of albums.
yeah, over 50 million selling records.
RJ, you have such experience in the music industry, and it's kind of fickle. What's hot one day is a little cool the next day, but then sometimes 20, 30 years later, it comes back. But with the Everly Brothers, I mean, they were so hot. And again, then their career kind of, let's just say, went a little cooler. I mean, they were still performing as, over in England. How does that reflect upon how we remember them? And how is it that when you're in the industry, what does that all mean? Is that a normal thing that you're really hot one minute and then you're cooling off the next, but then maybe you make a comeback?
There's always exceptions to the rule, but for the most part, people just kind of fizzle out after 3 or 4 years, or maximum 10. But I think that, they're really the golden years, the golden era of the Everly Brothers was probably around 57 to about 61 in my calculations. Kathy's Clown was like the epitome of, their sort of run. And then they going into the military kind of messed them up. And so that's kind of like what happened. And then they relied then on the touring or the performances. And then moving forward to the 80s, I think Paul McCartney, I can't remember what year, but he wrote this song On the Wings of a Nightingale. And I said, oh, this is going to be cool. And I think it did pretty well in England, but it did so-so over here. It was a really good song. It was great to hear it. But it wasn't strong enough to, bring them back like a Bye Bye Love or something like that. So that's kind of my take on it.
Venetia, I know that you don't have memories of that time. You were so little, but what is it your understanding of going on during that period, the drugs and the whatnot? Had there been mental problems in the family before, or was this the first time it's your understanding that Don had this sort of problem?
Well, I think my father suffered with depression, and couple that with the incredible work schedule they had, and the situation with prescribed drugs, the doctors giving them prescription. Uncle Phil was always a stronger personality, and it didn't things like that. He was able to get through. But I think my dad was always a little bit of the one. He was the one my grandmother worried about, just mentally, that he was always more sensitive, and the one that that just he had a deep depression, could go into a deep depression. And what is also happened to him in 62 was he had electric shock treatment, and at the time it was a barbaric treatment. And we I don't know how it affected him up until the day he died, but that was a serious treatment that he was given. And
And there's no way that didn't affect him.
yeah, there's no way. There's, from what I've heard, the way that they gave electric shock in those days was
Yeah.
just
Well, I
horrible.
imagine there was a lot of stress too because he got married again after your mother,
Yes.
and had a few more children. So I imagine being on the road and doing, the musician stuff, that would have to create a lot of issues with the family life.
Well, sure. I think that he had like the time when he was going through that problem was right after the divorce with my mom and when he first remarried. And then I think that when he came out of it and he had his other children, the career had slowed down. So there was that. And that's got to, be hard on your ego also, that you were at such heights, and then you were playing such large arenas, and now you're playing clubs. And plus it's probably not natural to work with your brother for all those years, attached at the hip for all those years.
Mhm.
Well, it was a perfect storm by 1973 when they broke up. And RJ was mentioning about Wings of a Nightingale. That was the song when they had after 10 years, and they came back in 1983 and did the Royal Albert Hall show.
And that way, let me make clear, they had broken up in
Yeah,
early 70s
in
and they didn't
73.
speak to each other.
They only, as far as I know, they spoke when my grandfather in 1975 was in the hospital having cancer surgery. We didn't know it was a cancer originally, but when he had surgery, my father was there and my Uncle Phil was there, and they were polite with each other. But that's as far as I know, the only time they spoke then and at the funeral. And then other than that, not till 1983 when they both somehow just had the idea of getting back together. I think Uncle Phil's friend, Terry Slater, I could be wrong on that, was the one who made that happen. And at that time, then they were excited to record another album, and I don't know if it was Dave Edmonds or who went to Paul McCartney and said, "Could you write a song for this album?" And that's when they came up with "Wings of a Nightingale," when Paul McCartney gave them that song. And I thought it was a great song, and I know it did okay on the adult contemporary charts. And at this point, they weren't pop stars, or going to go into the pop charts. They were adult contemporary.
Yeah, well, by the 80s, it was all about MTV and, all the
They
music
were not
videos, how you
MTV
looked, and yeah.
artists. Yeah.
And then so also during this period of time, they were struggling with getting along as well as reintroducing themselves to a fan base that had they had lost their attention for a while. So did they have a similar management at that time? Do we know if they?
I think they might have at the beginning. At the beginning, it was great. It was great when it first happened with the reunion. It was a reunion of the family also. We all were together, and it kind of fell apart pretty quickly. And then it became, two separate buses to, back to that. And just kind of, I think my Uncle Phil was more a family man, and he was the one trying to push for us all, to be involved and be there. But it just kind of fell apart pretty quick.
So, your your dad, his second marriage lasted about what, 5 years, 6 years?
I think longer than that. I'd say about 7 or 8 years. And then he was married to another woman in the 70s up to the time of the reunion in 83. Her name is Karen Prettyman, and I really liked her. I met her at the hospital with when my grandfather was in the hospital, and she was everything I know about her, and just being around her, she was great. I mean, I wish that it just he was very open at that point to things. I was receiving a lot of correspondence from
At least he
him.
wasn't discouraged not to
No,
get at that point.
I think Karen, she didn't have children, and I think she was really interested in trying to get the family together. But unfortunately, they got divorced at the time of uh, I don't know, they must have broke up right before the reunion in 83. And I really did not know he had a couple of serious girlfriends between then and when he married his last wife in 1997.
Was your dad a bit of a ladies' man? Was there a lot of women, do you think, even during his marriages, would you say?
I think that I don't think he was, I mean, I don't think he was ever alone between relationships, but I think that there were a multitude of relationships maybe going on the same time. At the last, I mean, I obviously when he was an older man, I don't, I
Yeah,
doubt anything
right.
else.
We hope you enjoyed Life's Third Act, sponsored by Cordell and Cordell, your advisors for estate planning and beyond. Subscribe and join us weekly for thought-provoking discussion and topics exclusively focused on estate planning and your financial future. Discover more at CordellCordell.com. The choice of a lawyer is an important decision and should not be based solely on advertisements.